So by globalization, we're talking about more or less this vast interlocking mechanism of technology and telecommunications. So when all said and done, that's the basic DNA of globalization. It's technology and telecommunications that basically end up interconnecting in such a way that's without any borders, without any boundaries. And then in effect, as a consequence of that, it makes a singular sort of worldwide political and economic system more obtainable. And it's primarily through a process we call standardization. This is why our pilots all sound the same when we get on the plane. It's called standardization, right? We get the same lecture every time we're on an airplane. It's standardization. It's a one-size-fits-all way of doing life. And whether you're dealing with politics, economics, human rights, whatever they are, you're dealing with a singular, standardized, protocol for how you approach whatever it is.
And
now,
we even start eating the same thing with the expansion of McDonald's.
Exactly right. My wife is from Japan, and I'll never forget one of the first times I was actually alone traveling in Japan. I was practicing my limited Japanese. I stopped into a McDonald's, of course, to get something to eat. I was hungry, and I was so proud of myself. I went up and I said, "Bango ichi," which means number one. I wanted the number one meal. And then she uttered off something in Japanese real quick. And I'm like, "Oh, come on, wakarimasen. I don't understand." She goes, "Do you want supersize?" And I said, "Sure, supersize." So, and then I go and I eat it, and I'm eating it staring out a window, looking at a Leonardo DiCaprio poster across a billboard. So there I am in downtown Tokyo, sipping a Coke, eating a Big Mac and looking at a Leonardo DiCaprio. That's globalization.
But we get to eat sushi in America, though. So we
do. So So when it's what we say, it's the difference between servant and master. It's like the old biblical conception of idolatry, right? As long as it is serving a greater purpose, globalization is wonderful. I mean, it gives us incredible advantages we just never had. I would never have met my wife if it weren't for super travel, for example. So, and I do like the fact that my pilots all speak the same language, which is English, the language of the airways, as it were.
Well, by the way, I just want to touch on that point. This is a fascinating topic, but yeah, the one thing I've noticed in traveling the world of late, which I've done quite a bit of actually in the last few years, is, and maybe people who travel less don't realize this, but how much English has become the universal language of the world. I mean, it is fabulous for an English-only speaking traveler such as me who hates other languages. I've just never been good at picking up other languages. But, you don't even have to try in most countries to interact in their native language. You just start speaking English, and if you're in a place that interacts with tourists, they speak English.
It really is. It's a fascinating thing, especially when we're dealing with Scandinavian nations. Their English is impeccable. So absolutely, and that is part of the standardization of globalization. Where it gets pernicious is when it starts replacing cultures through a process known as disembedding. So we've all experienced it with mom and pop shops in our local neighborhoods that have to board up because a local mall, just moved in. And if you think what a mall is, there's nothing local about a local mall, right? It's all chains, all local transnational corporations now and the like.
Well, and Walmart being perhaps the best example.
Walmart right? Being perhaps the best example.
It wipes out your local grocer, your local drugstore, your local toy store, your local hardware store.
You got it. And what we have to understand is when they wipe out local business, they're wiping out locality itself. They're wiping out localism. They're wiping out customs, cultures, traditions, and the like. And it gets even more pernicious through a process known as detraditionalization. We'll talk about retraditionalization in a minute. But detraditionalization is where the customs, cultures, and traditions that defined populations for centuries suddenly just don't have a home in a globalized world. There's no place for them because they can't get standardized. So if they can't get, if they're unique, then by definition, they tend to get pushed out. If they can't get, commercialized, if they can't get turned into a chain, then they really don't have much relevance. And so then that's when the human person moves away from, like family and faith and community as their foundation of creating a sense of what it means to be human, they end up instead of having those frames of reference and support, they end up becoming radicalized consumers. So now we have a choice to reinvent ourselves through the marketplace. And so that's why corporations tend to be very liberal, because they like the idea of getting rid of all these traditions so as to be able to feed you all kinds of possible identities that you can choose from. You can literally go from one identity one day to another identity another day. It's all fluid in a standardized, globalized structure. So that's
real
where
quick,
globalism becomes pernicious.
And maybe you're going to address social media real quick as it pertains to that.
Oh yeah, of course. So right. The selfie media, right? So I mean, and this is something obviously you and I have to deal with being on social media a lot. So social media again creates a new conception of the self. So the self now is understood in thoroughly network terms. Nobody in the history of humanity has ever lived a life that we show ourselves on Facebook, always smiling, always happy. Life is tough. Jordan Peterson reminds us, what is it? Life is a fatal disease, right? Life is hard. Life is difficult. And it requires very profound frames of reference to rest upon in order to flourish in such a difficult circumstance. And of course, that's where the traditions come from. That's why they've been around for so long, because they enable us to flourish as humans. So social media is going to take all that away, turn you more into an exhibitionist conception of the self that can change any moment of the day. I think in many respects, like we have, a secularized version of being born again with fashion, or the change in sexuality or gender or whatever it is. Those are all ways of being able to discover an authentic self. But little do we realize they're all options provided for us by the marketplace and by consumerism.
So it's hard to fight progress, and to some extent, when we talk about technology, clearly that's progress. So, and there's good and bad to what you're just talking about. I mean, having an international marketplace gives you economies of scale. It gets you the highest use of resources theoretically. So certainly people who frequent Walmart have appreciated incredibly cheap items there. I mean, I think the poor in America, frankly, have probably never lived better when it comes to material goods in America, because things are so darn cheap right now because it's coming from China. So how do we balance out the good with the bad to ultimately conclude that this is bad?
Yeah, so I don't think it's an either or. It is a balance, and again, it's making sure that globalism goes back to the notion of being a servant, and that's where economic nationalism is coming back now with a vengeance. Economic nationalism is not necessarily protectionism. It's not necessarily one approach to the economy by any stretch of the imagination. Economic nationalism fundamentally is the notion that the economy is an extension of one's culture. The economy is an extension of the character and the identity of a nation. So, for example, for some that might involve some significant protectionism, tariffs and the like. But for others, like Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, he sees Brazil as just so overwhelmed by Marxists over the last 30 years. He wants to open up Brazil. He wants it to be actually a bit more globalist, a more competitive, more free market. So he's operating from a much more libertarian approach to the market. But again, thoroughly from the notion of this is what's good for our nation and for us as a people, as circumscribed by borders and cultures and customs and the like. So I think a good, healthy dose of economic nationalism is the key. And how that looks is actually going to differ depending on what culture is employing it.
And how do political institutions play into this? Because when I think of globalization, I think of it more from a political standpoint of the EU, United Nations, and so on. I mean, I thought I was in support of Brexit because why add an additional layer of government? Because government is inherently bad to begin with. The less government, the better. And you're adding an additional layer, and you're just giving over your sovereignty to Brussels or what have you. And
right.
That most government, the best government is local government. The closer
Right.
government is to the problem, the more likely it is to be able to solve that problem. Having problem solved out of DC for 50 states is absurd. We put way too much power in DC, in my opinion. We need to go back to localized government, and we certainly don't want global government.
Right. Yeah. So that subsidiarity idea, that classical idea that, right, the local is better because, again, you have then very pragmatic culture, custom, tradition, localized dynamics to work out the problems because we all have to get along with each other. So we're able to figure it out best when it's handled locally. Globalization is the opposite. It tends to standardize, and standardization requires top-down management. And so what we were facing, for example, you say in Europe and Britain, or what's going on now with Hungary and Poland is, you had the whole 2015 migrant crisis, refugee crisis in North Africa and the Middle East. They're starting to flood into Europe. And then the so-called bullies in Brussels, say, okay, well, everybody has to take a certain amount of these refugees. And Britain and Poland and Hungary are saying, no, thank you. They're not going to get along in our culture or society. I think it was Slovakia that turned around and said, we don't have a single mosque. There's no point for them to be coming here and the like. And Brussels responded, well, too bad. You have to take them. And their response was, well, but we're a sovereign nation. We're Hungarians, and Hungarians are going to decide who comes in and who doesn't. We're Polish are going to decide. And the bullies in Brussels said, sorry, no, you relinquish that when you join the EU. When you join the EU, now we make those decisions. You don't. And that's been the battle that's been going on, particularly since 2015. And that was the huge thing in Brexit that Nigel Farage was able to exploit quite well, saying, look, is Britain going to be run by Brits, or is it going to be run by Brussels? You can't have it both ways. And by God's grace, we're seeing more and more populations say we're going back home, we're going back locally. And so we're seeing the globalist modernist structure sort of breaking up, really start with the Soviet Union on December 25th, 1991. And ever since then, it seems scholars like Sam Huntington, Clash of Civilizations thesis from Harvard, he said, we can expect to see more and more globalist modernist structures, because I think communism was just an alternative globalism. We could start seeing those structures begin to break up. People are just going back home, as it were, which is conservatism in many respects. Our two foundational documents are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey for Western civilization. The Iliad is people far away from home, and they're in constant war and strife and turmoil. And the only solution is in book 2, which is the Odyssey. You got to go home. You got to return home. It's the prodigal son parable. That's where we find our human flourishing.
Okay, so now let's turn to Christianity, and what is the role of Christianity in having people return home and to fight against this globalism?
Yeah, so this is Samuel Huntington's thesis, and he wasn't, in many ways, I think he was a bit of a latecomer. So you had like Francois Lyotard arguing in the late 70s. You had another Frenchman, Michel Mafusoli, writing in the late 80s about a postmodernism that was coming into the world that was breaking up the modernist structures that have been built over the last couple of centuries, the EU, the UN, the Soviet Union, and all that sort of stuff. And the question is, why are they breaking up? Well, because populations aren't putting their trust in one-size-fits-all political and economic systems anymore. That's a very modernist conception of the world. But postmodernists tend to see that as just arrogance. They like to see that different cultures have different views of life and so on. So postmodernism doesn't really have the structure to support modernist institutions. And so what populations are doing is they're just kind of, as it were, they're going back home. They're returning to the notion of identity. They're returning to the notion of nationhood, as we can see in our own land, and the notion of race and ethnicity. And so as part of that, they're also returning to their religious traditions that undergirded their civilizations for the last several centuries, because they're seen as having a certain authenticity. They're seen as having something that, in order for something to be truly postmodern, ironically, it has to be pre-modern. Because if it's postmodern and it's something new, then by definition it's modern. That's what made the modern world in the 18th century. We're going to try something new. We're going to throw out the church. We're going to throw out monarchy. We're going to throw out religion. And eventually, we're going to throw out family. We're going to throw out all these things, and we're going to try something new. We're on a brave new world. Now we're seeing nobody's offering anything new anymore, Jim, if you think it through. No one's offering anything new. Everyone's going back. Even what we're seeing with BLM, all we're seeing with Antifa is destruction. And what we're seeing with BLM is sort of this radical tribalism, this neo-tribalism that's thoroughly pre-modern. So what we're finding is that populations are going back. And when they're going back, they're going back to pre-modern frames of reference. They're no longer interested in a Brave New World, Star Trek kind of world. All our science fiction now are dystopias. They don't trust the future. The future is not something anyone's looking forward to. So they're going back to the past because that's where we can find our true identity. That's where we had it together before this horrible modernist experiment. So, Wakanda forever and all this kind of imaginary that's bringing people back to a more simple, sacred time. And for the West, that involves a revitalization of our classical Christian frames of reference.
So returning to religion, though, is dubious, considering the history of religion and the warring that's going on in religion and the fundamental devotion to religions. And I mean, there's been a lot of positives and negatives to religion, but in today's world of fundamental Islam and that whole battle, the idea of Christianity rising, I mean, it almost sounds like a bit of a holy war. So, and we certainly don't want to go in that direction. So by advancing the idea that we need to return to Christianity, which I assume you're advancing that, right? You're saying that we should be trying to return to Christianity. But
well, I'm making a twofold argument. I'm making an argument that we are, whether we want to or not. And then I am saying that is certainly to be preferred than to the secularizing tendencies of a modernist world. Yeah.
So first, starting with the fact that we are, that I think is surprising for me to hear. I don't know if that's you predicting this or saying that statistically we've already seen it, because from my casual observation, maybe being in Los Angeles changes that perspective a bit, but I certainly don't see the churches, the numbers in the pews, save for putting COVID aside, obviously.
Right.
but the numbers in the pews seem to me to have been going down. Am I wrong about that?
Yes, very much so. Yeah. The number, regular church attendance in the United States has not gone down for 40 years. I mean, every sociological study on here, Rodney Stark of Baylor University has the meta study on this. We haven't seen a dip in church attendance in literally four to 5 decades.
Now, are we talking in real numbers or percentage?
Yeah, in real numbers. Yeah. So as the population increases, so does church attendance.
So you're saying, because in the last 40 years, population has probably close to doubled in the United States?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So you're saying that the Catholic Church, for instance, its followers have doubled?
Yeah. So you're talking about, well, again, if you're talking in per capita, so it's staying with population growth. Sure.
Right. So population has doubled in those 40 years. You're saying adherence to the Catholic faith has also doubled.
Yeah, it would have gone up with the population. Yeah. So what you have to recognize is that 60% of the population that doesn't go to church on any regular basis never did. So you've got a 40%.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but when you say never did, I mean going back to, say, the founding, in the 1700s.
No. Yeah, well, but even actually, more of us are going to church today than were at the founding. Remember, churches were hard to get to. They weren't necessarily easy, like in the medieval period. They were mostly in the cities, at least in Europe. So most people didn't actually go to church on a regular basis.
That's an interesting point. Yeah, but as far as adherence, though, the adherence had to be much higher.
So this is the change, and this is the modernist world that we saw arise. The change is that the 40% who go to church on a regular basis, that hasn't changed. What's changed is the self-identity of the 60% that has not gone in these last 40 years, has not gone to church on a regular basis. That's changed. Back in the day, back in the 50s and 60s, they just called themselves Christians. That's what else are you going to call yourself? Christmas, Easter, Thanksgiving. What else are you going to call yourself? And there's a logic to that, and there's a very good logic to that, and that they're beneficiaries of Christendom, of a Christian culture that lasted for 1,200 years. So okay, we've got that. But then we notice in the late 60s, 70s, and 80s, they start changing that identification the more the category secular starts coming out. So then they might say, okay, well, I think I'm a bit more secular, or the more notorious term, the nuns, right? Not N-U-N-S, N-O-N-E-S, the nuns. I don't have any religion. And you don't miss a year when Washington Post or New York Times says, secularism is growing in our nation and nuns are growing in our nation. No, they are not. That's a very misleading analysis of the data. What's growing is nothing. 40% regular church attendance, 60% non-church attendance. What's changing is the terms they're designating themselves for. And that term differential is happening within a population that has not increased in the least.
That's but if I'm understanding what you're saying, it's still very significant change that if among those 60% that aren't going to church, if a far fewer are identifying themselves as Christians and instead as secularists or as nuns or whatever you want to refer to it, compared to 50 years ago, 100 years ago, or whatever you want to compare it to. I mean, that's a significant change, isn't it?
It is, in the sense that modernist frames of reference are playing themselves out. So what modernity basically said is that we're now going to have, so when I say modernity, we're talking the 18th century Enlightenment, that basically said the enduring element of that was that we're going to have a revolution of knowledge that says that anything that is not scientifically provable is going to be expelled from the realm of knowledge. So you can believe, you have a soul, but you can't know it. You can believe there's a God, but you can't know it. That's because it's impervious to the method by which we now determine knowledge. And as that works itself out, the church gets increasingly marginalized into the periphery of society. So you see that even in our urban planning, where, a New England Commonwealth or, a European city, old medieval city would have the church right in the center of things.
So yeah, talking about that group and how that group has changed from.
Okay, so the way that's working out, because I think it's an important point. So what we're seeing is that the scientific rationalism ends up changing even just the very urban planning that we have. So we're in the medieval more medieval city or the New England Commonwealth. The church is right at the center of life. Now, today, where's the church? It's right next to pizzerias and dry cleaners, right? You see Pizza Hut, and you see Dunkin' Donuts, and you see First Methodist, and therefore, by definition, then it can't really preach truth anymore, because truth is a public thing. It's truth that I got to pay my taxes. It's truth that I could go to prison if I don't, and if I commit tax fraud and the like. If I get pushed next to a yoga class or Weight Watchers class, that's not truth, not in the ultimate sense that you could build a civilization on it. So there's no question that the modern restructuring of the world has created both a very, I don't want to say dumbed down, but a very reductionist conception of Christianity on the one hand for the average churchgoer, that 40%, but also something very unenticing and very uninteresting, frankly, irrelevant for the 60%. So yes, absolutely, that's a major shift. What we happen to be seeing, though, is with the death of those modern frames of reference. I mean, now nobody believes science is the only way we know. I see it with my students all the time. They may start that way, but the moment you kind of question them a little bit, well, can scientists be wrong? they buckle under the pressure. Well, of course, we can't know anything. That's the postmodern frame of reference. Now that's opened up space to re-examine faith and classical religions and so forth in terms of their role of what it means to be human. Now, of course, nobody wants to go back to any kind of abuses or anything like that. Of course, we hope we've learned something from anything like that. But certainly people do want a sense of authenticity. They want a sense of meaning and purpose. And it's very hard to find it in just solely secular frames of reference, especially when the very scientific rationalist foundations for that seem to be eroding away as the one-size-fits-all way of understanding the world. So I think that's kind of what's going on with this. I don't think it's a coincidence we're seeing more cults, and more spirituality or resurgent paganism, a real neo-paganism in the world today. That is going right along with this idea of a return.
Yeah, well, when I think of BLM and Antifa, I kind of think of that as cults that are replacing religion. As you point out, people searching for some meaning beyond themselves, and they're latching on to these radical concepts, which you could see how somebody could get sucked into the idea and get very passionate about the idea of ending racism, and getting all worked up about it and convincing yourself that this is this horrendous problem that needs to be cured through any means necessary. I mean, it's very cultish.
It is, and because of course it's not based on any real evidence. If we're looking at this from an evidential perspective, it tends to be wildly exaggerated. Heather McDonald of the Manhattan Institute has done studies on this. Thomas Sowell, who's himself Black, of Stanford University, has done studies. Of Walter Williams, Carol Swain of Vanderbilt University, Princeton, tenured scholar there, Black as well. None of them buy any of the BLM rhetoric in the least. It's not rooted in any evidential basis whatsoever. So in a sense, it's like it's a revelation. It's very ethereal. It's very numinous.
But I could make the same critique about Christianity, because Christianity really isn't based on any scientific basis. It's based on ancient stories where scientific review of it or even historical review of it seems to discredit it, whether you're talking about faith or
yeah. Well, we could get into that if you want, but no, I think you're comparing apples and oranges there. I mean, when you're talking about BLM's attempt to make universal claims versus a Christianity that's rooted in literally a 5,000-year wisdom tradition that rationally sees infinite eternal being as the necessary precondition for any finite thing, you're dealing with the difference between infinity and Santa Claus. Just because you can't see something doesn't make it non-real.
No, but I mean, the problem is, and I think the reasons, with the scientific revolution and why that's been a challenge.
That came out of Christianity, Jim. That came out of Christian frames of reference.
But
it didn't come out of Islam.
But it is still made, whereas creation stories and Noah's Ark stories,
Jim. But I get what you're saying, but I mean sorry, I don't mean to cut you off, but that's absurd. I mean, look, Jordan Peterson has done a fantastic job in trying to frame this in a way that can help people make sense of it in our postmodern hangover. We all have creation myths. We all have creation stories. Evolution is a creation myth. Evolution is a creation story. Oh, but it's rooted in evidence. That's called a myth. There is no evidence for evidence. It's rooted in a sacred commitment to evidence because we believe this is what enables us to flourish as humans. And it's the same thing with Christianity. Christianity is rooted in fundamental commitments that we believe, and we have 2,500 years with the Judeo-Christian working out, 3,500 years. We believe those frames of reference are indispensable to human flourishing and can create an extraordinarily humane literature, art, architecture, music, and poetry and drama, unlike anything the world has ever seen. Certainly modernity has not been able to do that. Its architecture is probably the ugliest thing we've ever seen on the planet. So all I'm saying is that, and then of course Christianity does have its evidences. The claims of Christ having risen from the dead is not taken surely on faith. there are some pretty impressive evidences that N.T. Wright and other scholars have talked about. So no, I think you're being a little reductionist there. I'll be happy to beat up BLM on it, because I think, again, BLM is a kind of micro belief, not a macro belief like Christianity, a micro belief that evidence ends up surrounding and snuffing out in a way that, I mean, the moment you start trying to take on macro beliefs like that, I'm going to ask you what's the evidence for your macro beliefs, but then I'm also going to ask you what's the evidence for evidence.
Yeah, well, it's a question that I've always had, is that, we need more selflessness in society. We need more honor. We need more morals and ethics. I think, we're lacking that in Washington significantly, and just generally speaking, as you see how people are treating each other out there. And a lot of people say that, yeah, that's because people aren't, the number of adherents to various religious faiths has declined, and they're not getting that in the churches and so on. And my question is, where can't we still have that? Is Christianity the only solution for bringing that type of honor and selflessness and caring to people? Because I mean, certainly it fills that role, but with so many people having left Christianity, right, where else can they get that from?
Sure, absolutely. Well, there is what's known as the Philosophia Perennis, so the perennial philosophy. And so the perennial philosophy is it's a fancy way of saying, when we come together and we really think together over the ages as a human population, whether it's Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, Islamic, secular, you name it, whatever it is, as we come together and we try to figure, what does it mean to be human? How are we to act? What does meaning mean? That's a very interesting question. What is the significance of life? Where are we going? All these sort of things. What we actually find is we have a lot of common frames of reference to overlap with, like a Venn diagram. And I think in many respects, that's what the founding fathers were interested in. They knew in order for us to be truly free, we had to be virtuous. But if we were going to be virtuous, we had to have a very real faith of some kind. But if we're going to have a real faith, not coerce, it's got to be free. But if we're going to be truly free, we got to be virtuous, and on and on and on. It's the triangle of freedom. So I don't think that modernist frames of reference are providing it anymore. I'll even say not because there's anything. I do think there's inherent problems in modernity. But I don't think I don't think someone like a Sam Harris or something is having those problems. I think he's able to get through life just fine, basically. But I do think modernity has fallen. There's no question philosophically on that. We've moved into a postmodern world. And if we don't have secularity of modernity as our anchor anymore, then how do we arrive at that common ethic that you're talking about, where we're engaging in civic virtue and trying to live in truth and honesty and caring for our neighbors and the like? Well, Christianity has a very, very profound frame of reference for that. But so does Buddhism, so does Hinduism, so does contemplative secularism, so does spirituality. And I think as we come together and we have those conversations, in many respects, I'm arguing that's sort of what the new Christendom is. The new Christendom we can't remove secularism completely. We're not, we're not Bolsheviks. We're not trying to, do the opposite, right, of imploding churches. We're not trying to implode the history of natural museums or anything like that. When you're moving into a new phase in society, you're going to bring the phases from the previous society. Just as cathedrals have come into modernity, just as religion and faith has come into secular society, so secular society is going to come into religion and faith and their comeback. So I just think there's going to be a bit more of what we would call an interinstitutionality. I think the church is going to have a little more say, or a little more, maybe not say, because that has a bit of a pejorative to it. The church is going to have a little bit more of a contribution to what really contributes to a flourishing society than, say, it had in the 60s and 70s and 80s when modernity was at its height.
Let me run this concept by, and it'll give you a good idea of where my head is on this. And that is, I've had this idea of Jesus's teachings are fabulous. They're similar to Buddhist teachings and so on, as far as how to treat each other and so on, turn the other cheek. I mean, lots of great lessons in there, but it's all tied in interconnected with the cult of Christianity also as a religion. But those teachings, you know, how can we teach those teachings without, you know, do I have to believe that Jesus was born of a virgin and is the Son of God and came here to redeem us all of our original sin that started back with Adam and Eve? Do I have to buy into that whole narrative in order to appreciate his teachings and live by his teachings?
Yeah, well, you're talking to an Eastern Orthodox guy, so we don't believe in original sin, but we'll leave that part out for you.
I was raised Catholic, so I guess that's where I got that.
There you go. Okay, so you got it. You got a heavy dose of that Augustinian stuff. All right, so we can get into it. But yes, no, we all believe every faith, everyone, even secularists, even Ocasio-Cortez has to believe in some kind of fall that they're trying to rescue us from. No question about it. Well, so there's an answer. I mean, the simple answer to that is a yes and a no. And at a superficial level, no, of course, we're all beneficiaries of thousands and thousands of generations prior to us, and the society they built, for better or for worse. We're all inheritors of it, and we're going to live in those frames of reference. There's all kinds of anthropological studies on how societies kind of maintain themselves through what's called social imaginaries and all that. So you and I are using English that's been around for 1,000 years, that we don't know the first thing about the theology behind it. We don't know the first thing about all these things, but yet we use it. It's practical. It helps us to get through life, that kind of stuff. The question, I think, is when you're trying to think about life, social life, civilizational being, you're really getting into the question of what does life really mean, and our societies, how they're built in terms of time and space, reveal that. So a cathedral is going to tell you that time and space are inherently sacred, and they have been redeemed in the virgin birth and the life, death, and transformative resurrection of Christ. That's what a cathedral says. That's what a castle across from the cathedral says, that space and time is sacred, and we're supposed to make visible and tangible that sanctity. That's what Rembrandt is telling us. That's what Michelangelo is telling us. That's what Bach is telling us. That's what Arvo Pärt is telling us, the Estonian composer today, most sought after composer in the world today. So that's what they're telling us. What a strip mall tells us is that time and space are meaningless. They have no meaning. And the only meaning they have is whatever meaning you want to give to it. And our meaning generally is it's got to be cheap and it's got to be quick. And if I don't need any more, I've got to knock it down. Now, you got to be careful, because when you build a cathedral, it says that this is a meaning and a purpose that's permanent, and therefore as we participate in it, we're permanent. We're going to be here our civilization is going to be here for thousands of years. Cathedrals aren't just set up to then be knocked down like a tent. But strip malls are. And when you have a society that's building stuff and producing stuff that's meant to be obsolescent, that's meant to be thrown away. I don't think any of us are going to be handing down our computers to our great-grandchildren, right? That has built-in obsolescence, that it's here today, gone tomorrow. Then why should we expect anyone to want to protect our society? So I do think these are legitimate questions. It's a long way around to answer, to say, well, at one level, no, but at another level, yeah, we're going to have to consider the mythological element. And I don't use mythological as unreal. I use it in the Greek sense of mythos, as the archetypes, the absolute meta-narratives by which we live out our lives, and inherent of meaning and purpose. We all have to do it.
Well, you use the term mythology. Why isn't it okay that we follow it as a myth, but appreciate that ultimately what comes from it, I'm speaking Christianity, is positive. It's how to deal with your fellow man and community and selflessness, etc. But a recognition that, okay, but it is founded on these myths, as opposed to, again, having to believe in this narrative of Jesus, virgin birth, Son of God.
Yeah,
I have a problem with that.
I thought we went past that. I'm going to put you in the front row and keep my eye on you in class. We're all, so I go back to my original point, we're all governed by myths. It's a myth to think that scientific rationalism can give us a one-size-fits-all picture of reality. It's a myth to say that the world has no inherent meaning and purpose.
So you're saying, sorry, so you're saying that, yes, Jim, you're right. It is okay to look at it as a myth, as opposed to...
I'm saying, yes, Jim, you're right, if you define myth as an inescapable human category of thought that we cannot think without. So if you think that myths can be just jettisoned and thrown away because they're not true, you're not understanding the term myth as I understand it. Mythos, by its in its Greek term, means the meta-narrative, the overall, what's the good word? It's the paradigm by which I understand everything. So so a myth frames my understanding of reality. So if I say to you, the only thing we can know is that which is scientifically proved. Sounds rational. The only thing I know is that which can be scientifically proven to me. That's great, but it won't take long for somebody to point out to you.
Well, I think that's a fair thing to say.
Let me just finish the point. It won't take long for someone to point out to you. That's not scientifically provable. That itself is what we call a faith commitment. But faith commitments are not blind, because there's only so many faith commitments that can actually work in life. Again, Jordan Peterson, I think, has done some very good work on that in terms of bringing that to the popular realm. Cultural anthropologists have recognized this. Durkheim was arguing this at the turn of the 20th century. He called it the sacred. Only so many sacreds, that is absolute, unquestionable, non-negotiable, foundational beliefs by which we are going to build our societies, right? We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and that they're endowed by their great. That's mythos there. So if you want to turn around and say, no, when I say myth, I mean basically a step up from a fairy tale and a fiction and maybe these fictions point to this or that. You got to be careful, because that's based on a myth.
Well, there's a difference
based on the mythos of science.
But there's an important distinction, isn't there, between what you know and what you believe? So
again, there can be, but it's a modernist distinction to say that what we know and what we believe belong in fundamentally different categories. Because again, how do you know that, and do you believe that?
Well, you know it through science, so that would be the distinction as to what you know, and what you believe are things, and it's perfectly fine to believe in things that have not been proven or not proven.
But Jim, let's be blunt. What you just said was not a scientific statement. So you don't know.
I'm not a scientist.
No. You come back here now, Jimmy. You come back here. What you just said was not a scientific statement. Therefore, it was simply a statement of belief, and therefore not applicable to me. You see, this is the tough part about trying to think about where do we ground our society in.
Let me ask you.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Kind of another approach to kind of the same area that I thought about. The golden rule, I think, has an evolutionary explanation for it. Do you agree with that?
Oh, it certainly can. Sure, absolutely. Because again, it's for the benefit of everybody. If we're
also it's explained, the fact that everybody buys into it is explained by the fact that we realize we're all self-interested and selfish inherently, but we realize through the history of man is that, but you know what, if I only look out for myself, things ain't gonna go so well for all of us. So all of us need to treat each other as we would want to be treated. Man figured that out, otherwise we wouldn't have evolved, and hence the reason we're around today, and the reason that everybody seems to subscribe to this universal truth that the golden rule is the thing to live by.
Yes, absolutely. And again, we have studies like on chimps. If they just try, this is where again I think BLM is so wrong, and cultural Marxist is so wrong. If society is just built on power and beating everybody up to the top, once the chimp ends up getting to the top of the hierarchy, and if he was smashing everybody's skulls on the way up, the moment he turns his back, they all tear him to shreds. The chimp that's able to figure out how to make alliances, to do favors to others and so forth, and when he makes it to the top, the pack feels loyal to him. So absolutely, we see it in nature as well. So no question there. But again, I don't think that gets us very far.
Well, the only reason I know we got to wrap up, unfortunately, because the reason I raise that is Dennis Prager is somebody that I like to listen to quite a bit, but
sure.
He always seems to say that, hey, without religion, that we need that for order in society, for people to treat each other this way. We need religion. And I'm saying that I don't think we do. I think that we get the golden rule comes inherently through evolution. People recognize that we need to follow this. We don't need to believe in a particular religion to have this.
Yeah. Okay. So where I'll go with you on what you just said. I was almost about to, but in other words, you said we don't need a particular. Okay, I'll go with that. Yes. It's the question of when you say we don't need religion. And again, I don't know where Dennis is coming from in terms of his actual definition of religion, but if a cultural anthropologist were in the room with us, I studied cultural anthropology at Durham University. If they were in a room with us, they'll remind us that religion is one of the most hard things to actually really define and nail down. And cultural anthropologists tend to see religion as that meta-narrative. They tend to see it as those sacred, absolute, unquestionable beliefs and rules and understandings and goals that we're talking about right now. We want the human species to survive. We want to flourish as human beings because we think that's meaningful and that's good. That's our sacred. And in a cultural anthropological sense, that's our religion. That's why BLM can become a religion. That's why Antifa can become religions, because we're attracted to those things that we think provide ultimate meaning and purpose in our lives. The problem with them, again, is if it's too small, you can get duped. It's got to be much bigger and much larger and be able to answer questions not only of, all right, how do we get along, our ethic, but also questions of meaning and purpose. What is a family? What is literature, art, architecture, music, poetry? How should our politics be arranged? What do we think of the cosmos? What's our relationship to the cosmos? That's big stuff. And historically speaking, that's the role that religion played in answering those questions.
Thank you to Dr. Steve Turley. You can check his show out on YouTube under Steve Turley. He also has a website called Turley Talks, which you should check out. Thank you to our producer, Michael Parker. Thank you to our intern, Jake Wall. And we'll be back soon with another episode of The Hidden Truth Show.
Thank you for listening to The Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow. You can find us at hiddentruthshow.com. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Truth Show. Join us again next week for another episode of Hidden Truth Show with Jim Breslow.